This is House Planning Help, episode 281. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in building a house. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. And coming up in this session, my guest is Tully Gallagher, and we're going to be looking at why he gave up on hiring a main contractor and decided, you know what, I'm going to do this myself. Was it the right move? I think so, because he now runs Beartooth Passive House. So we'll find out about that. I'm fresh back from a conference. This is the Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo that's hosted by the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And I've been to this a few times now. It's always quite inspiring, quite invigorating, particularly when you can see a lot of stuff going on around the world that's not so good. And then you see this and they have their awards ceremony. And my goodness, it's so difficult to pick a winner, but good to see a few folk that have popped up on the podcast. Neil Sutherland and Makar did really well. Also on the short list was Mark Siddle from Leap, and yeah, just some great projects there. So a very balanced program overall as well. I felt I had a number of chats with people where we just saying, you know, we've got to do the materials, we've got to get the energy efficiency, we've got to do the whole lot. So definitely a successful conference, and I look forward to next year's. Let's get to our interview. We're heading to Montana today, and it's an interesting episode if, for one reason or another, you're going to be hands-on with your builds. You're a practical person. Maybe you've never built a house before. Well, this story in itself is inspiring because Tully hadn't either. So why did he go ahead with it? How did it all go? And how does he find himself now in charge of his own business in the construction sector? We'll find out. I started by asking Tully, though, when he'd first thought about building a house.
I came up with the idea probably 2017 was the first time I thought, hey, let's build it for ourselves. We had been looking at building a higher performance home, but having someone else do the envelope for us. That ended up falling through in 2017, and we came up with the idea, hey, what if we just do it ourselves?
Why did it fall through?
Ended up being some issues with that builder, and he had sustained a back injury, and he was located in a town that was a couple hours away from us. So he was going to have to do some building prefab style at his location and then bring everything over to our location. And then timing and an injury from him kind of made that not possible.
So what experience did you have before this?
Not a whole lot in terms of big construction. I mean, I'd done a number of small remodels in the houses and apartments that I had lived in prior. But in terms of any type of actual big building where it was a full scale breaking ground to living in a finished project, I had zero experience from that. I took the Passive House Builders training in 2017, so that put me in contact with some pretty good people who actually did it for a living, and I leaned on them pretty heavily during the planning phases to just have them give me tips, you know, in terms of this is a good idea or that's a terrible idea. You should think about doing it a different way.
So this training, do you think it taught you a lot more than the practical experience of your remodels?
In terms of the passive house detailing, yes, 100%. And I think that's something that I'd done a lot of, you know, my own self-taught learning on passive house before the actual tradesperson training. But that tradesperson training really helped out on the passive house side of things. Now on the just construction and nailing things together and standing walls up. Some of the previous remodel stuff had helped, but in reality, it was just a lot of research. And then you just got to jump in at some point and figure out what works and what doesn't work.
Is this a carpentry-led route?
Yeah, I would say carpentry was probably the thing I was most comfortable with in terms of like the remodels and stuff I had done some tiling and some things like that, but that wasn't necessarily heavy on my mind when thinking about our project. It was more the carpentry and the details associated with being able to achieve, you know, airtightness and a lot of insulation and our window install and all of that kind of thing.
What gave you the confidence that you're going to go ahead and do this?
A little bit of self-confidence, a little bit of, if we're going to build a house like this, we're pretty much the only ones that are going to be able to do it because no one around here has even heard of passive house, let alone built a passive house.
You got no choice by the sounds of it.
Yeah, it was pretty much like, hey, I think we could figure this out. And if we're going to do it, we're going to pretty much have to do it ourselves. So let's go.
Wow. Okay, so we know that you're doing it now. Are you doing everything, or what's in, what's out?
Yep. So up until the point where we framed some interior walls upstairs, which were, non-load bearing and just to the walls for bedrooms and bathrooms and such upstairs, I had done every single thing with the help of my father and a couple other people. When we were setting roof trusses, it helped to have 3 or 4 people. But other than that, the framing, the window installs, all of the passive house detailing with the air sealing, the installation of the ERV, and all of that has been 100% myself doing it.
Wow. Well, let's rewind for a moment here. So you're doing it all on site, but what about the designs? How are you making sure that this is a good design to begin with?
You bet. So from the very beginning, when we had decided that we were going to build the house ourselves, we said, let's keep the form super simple. So we just have a rectangle that's 2 stories and has engineered roof trusses. So it's about as easy as it can get from a shape perspective. Mm-hmm. And then from the passive house side of things, the training that I took in 2017 was from a company in Denver called EMU Systems. They are trying to develop more standardized construction systems for different climate zones. And at that time, they were looking for partners to pilot their building system. We ended up finding out that was a pretty good fit between what they were looking for and what we were doing in our project. So the construction system and all the building science and the wall details and the window install and all of that was a result of working with EMU and their standardized construction system.
And the site itself, what constraints were there?
Not a whole lot. It was property that we owned ourselves. It was relatively flat. It's on top of a hill, and come to find out, it's really, really windy here. So for the most part, it was easy digging. We just have a crawl space foundation, so we didn't have to dig real deep, and we didn't run into any rocks. I'd say the biggest thing was, the closest to any type of major home improvement building store, we're probably about an hour and 15 minutes away. We do have some local lumber stores, and we leaned on them pretty heavily, and it was good because they were introduced to some newer products that they hadn't heard about before, but they were able to source a lot of that for us.
And how many buildings are there around you, for services and things like that?
You mean in terms of like electrical services, or
yes,
just like the population of
well,
the town
just
that we're in?
For context, yeah. If you want to connect to the electricity grid or anything like that, yeah. How are you looking? It sounds quite remote.
You bet. So the town of Red Lodge is 2,000 people. We're probably 4 miles outside of town, but we're out the back of a subdivision. So a lot of the houses around us might have an acre or 2 lot. But in terms of being able to connect to utilities, we kind of picked the location of the house based on the fact that we had a transformer a couple hundred feet away from us. So installing that electrical line wasn't going to be a big deal, and being able to have the utility company come out and put a meter was going to minimize cost. And then from a water perspective, we're on a septic and our own well. So we had to drill a well, have a company come out and drill a well for us. And then we had to install a septic system as well.
What do you need to think about for those 2 things, a well and a septic system?
Biggest thing was looking at whichever requirements you have, either regulatory or county requirements. So we're kind of lucky in that we're building outside of the city limits. In the state of Montana, if you are a homeowner builder, you do not have to pull plumbing permits. You actually don't even have to pull a building permit The only permits that we need are electrical permit and sanitation. So the septic piece had to be sent into the county, and then the county had to approve the design, and then that all had to occur before we could start constructing it. So one of the requirements when you're looking at being on a well and having a septic system is spacing of the well from the septic tank and your leach field. So that was something that we knew going into it. We had to make sure that the well location, which was more flexible than the drain field location, worked from a spacing perspective.
How deep does it go, the well?
Our well is about 140 feet deep.
Because you were on the top of the hill, you were saying earlier, yeah. So I actually have no context for whether that's deep or not.
So that's it's probably in line with the other wells around us. Everyone else has a well as well. So I wouldn't say that's overly deep compared to other wells. You've got some wells that are drilled down to 110 feet. Other wells are down to 170 feet. So not terribly deep.
And what's the process then with digging the well? You know, is it very, very narrow, literally just sending a drill down, and then what else do you need to do?
Yep. So you hire a well company. They come out with a rig. They pretty much drill a big hole down to about 25 feet, and then they drill the small hole down until they hit water. We ended up hitting water relatively high, but the water wasn't clean. So we had to keep going deeper. Clean meaning it was pretty muddy. So we had to drill deeper until we got to nice clean water. And then we isolated that dirtier water whenever they cased the well, which just basically means they ran a big PVC pipe down into the well. But so once the well's drilled, it's probably 75 feet or so away from the house. Then you end up having to run a pump into the well, and then you run a line into the house, and then you have a pressure tank that supplies the pressure to the house and holds, I guess, a reserve of the water. And then with the well, you end up having a pressure switch, and that's where your electricity that powers the well actually goes into the pressure switch.
Are you treating the water at all? You've mentioned that you've dug down that extra bit to get to some good stuff.
Other than some water filters inside the house for drinking water, and that's just to, make it a little bit cleaner. We don't really have to do anything. The water that we hit really didn't have any smells when we had it tested for chlorides and hardness and TDS and all of those things. It was in line with acceptable water. So we're not doing anything above and beyond just putting it into the pressure tank and then having it feed the house.
And the septic tank, will there be, once that's done, any maintenance or anything that you need to think about?
Not really. So the septic was installed about a month and a half ago. So we've got a 1,000 gallon septic tank, and then that is sized based off of how many bedrooms are in the house. So if you've got 3 bedrooms, you got a 1,000 gallon septic tank. If you have 4 bedrooms, you need a 1,500 gallon septic tank. But we just have a 1,000 gallon septic tank. You kind of keep an eye on it every year to be able to look into it and make sure that the solids aren't building up too much. And then if they are, then you have to have a pump truck come in and empty out the septic tank. But that's really the only maintenance that's involved with it.
So we haven't really talked too much about what you're hoping to get out of the house. We know it's a passive house, but it's for the whole family here. So what were some of the things on the brief?
I'd say the biggest thing for us was this is our forever home. Even though my wife and I aren't too old and our kids are pretty young, I've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. We knew that we were moving back to Montana. My parents are a quarter mile away. We can look down on it right now. It was a house to be able to bring us back home, have the kids grow up in small towns like both my wife and I grew up in. And then for it to be the most healthy, comfortable place to live in for the family, since we'll be here for so long.
And your choice of build system, you did mention it earlier, but maybe you can give us a bit more detail about that.
You bet. When you look at high performance building, it seems like there's 15 different construction systems. Any way that you can think of building a really big, fat, thick wall, people have done it. For us, it was nice to partner with Emu because they had their construction system picked out. So I didn't have to think about whether or not I was going to build a traditional interior wall and then have external insulation, or what that construction system looked like. Their construction system is a double stud wall. So going with their system made it nice and easy. I didn't have to think about what I was going to do. All I knew was I had a double stud construction system, and then that made all the planning pretty easy.
So it's a passive house system.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's our walls are the insulated thickness ends up being 15.5 inches insulation, and then overall wall thickness, once you take into account interior finishing and the exterior siding, will be close to 20 inches in some parts.
And what is that insulation?
We use mineral wool bats. Mm-hmm. So a lot of double stud, they'll do a dense pack insulation of either fiberglass or cellulose. In our area, no one really does that. There aren't any insulation contractors that use cellulose. And even if they do, the most that they'll dense pack it is maybe 5.5 inches. So talking about needing a 13-inch or 15.5-inch dense pack, no one really had any experience with that. So we didn't necessarily want to be guinea pigs. I bought a commercial insulation machine, but I didn't necessarily want to make myself the first guinea pig with that amount of insulation. So going with a bat insulation that the quality control and the engineering and everything of that is done in the factory, that made it pretty easy for us. And we did the insulation install ourselves, and the bats worked pretty well.
And what about your air tightness strategy?
Yep, that was something that was definitely looked at real early on when we were taking Emu's construction system and then fitting it into the shape of the house. Really, since it's a rectangle, it's pretty easy. We didn't have any crazy junctions. The only junction that we had to think about was the second story floor system, how to get the air barrier out and around those floor joists. But it was definitely something that we thought of early on, and we picked the materials that we used for that air barrier specifically because they were really easy to work with, and they were really strong and robust and could stand up to, if someone accidentally bumped into them or something accidentally hit it and ripped it, it was pretty easy to repair and get it back to, air sealed. But for the most part, the detailing of it was pretty simple.
Yeah, it does make life a lot easier, doesn't it? And where are you up to at the moment in the build?
Finishing interior stuff right now. So we moved in almost a month ago, partly because we wanted to move in, partly because the house that we were renting at the time, we had to be out, and rental homes are pretty hard to find in our area. So we were at the point where we could move in. When we moved in, first couple nights, we brushed our teeth in the kitchen sink, and we finally got a vanity installed in one of the bathrooms. So that was a big win. But right now we are living in it. We don't have interior doors. Those are on order and should hopefully be here next week. And then it's finishing all the window trim, and then we're doing a lime plaster on the interior of all the walls. So we just started that install in one of the bathrooms earlier this week. And that'll be a big undertaking for me just because we have a lot of square footage and I don't have a ton of experience doing it. But the first results in the bathroom are really cool. So we're pretty happy with that.
And it doesn't sound to me like there's a danger of work slowing. Sometimes when you move in, that can be, we'll slow down a little bit.
It definitely has a little bit.
Oh, was it?
Well, like the ability to, knowing that we're in the house right now, if I don't get that one piece of window trim on today, and instead I, go outside and move around or go to the gym and work out or go up to the mountain and do some skiing, that makes it a little bit easier. But up until the point we moved in, it was some of the more major things that we were doing, making sure that we got our hot water system slightly different, and that we were using a CO2 heat pump hot water heater. So that was different than just being able to plug in a electric resistance water heater and connect electricity to it and have everything up and running. But it slowed a little bit, but I'm okay with that because we're finally in it and we're experiencing what we've been building for the last year and a half or so.
Yeah, exactly. Now, how have you found time for all of this? Because there's no doubt you're going to save money going down this route. Was it a playoff between doing work versus actually doing the project?
100%. So before we started the project, we were living in Denver, Colorado. I had got a mechanical engineering degree out of school and was working as an engineer in Denver and been doing that for 10 years. My wife didn't work because she was taking care of the kids, but we know we wanted to move back home. So we were trying to figure out, how do we get back home? What do we do for jobs? And it got to the point where I knew I wasn't going to be able to do what I was doing in Denver, in Montana for work. And it got to the point where we just had to jump. So I quit my job. We moved back home to Montana. My full-time job is building the house and was building the house. My wife was able to get a job in town with the school, so we at least had some income coming in. Yeah, I mean, we left. We went from having, very stable income, stable benefits, a pretty consistent life, to moving back home, not having jobs, living in rental houses, and then we're finally able to get in not too long ago.
So let's talk about actually building this, doing it, having that on your shoulders. What's been the biggest challenge?
Probably finding time to walk away from it at times. I think right when I started, I want to say for nearly 2.5 months, I probably didn't come out to the job site only one day. I was wanting to get things built, and it got to the point where coming out every day, I started to become a little bit more easily agitated, and I just needed a break. So that's something that was a struggle for me all the way through building, knowing that I want to continue making progress so that we can move in, but at the same time, I need to take a break so mentally and physically I can kind of recover. That was by far the biggest challenge that I had.
Would you have done anything differently in terms of that?
No. It's stressful. I'd like to say that I've had way more stress in the last year and a half than I had in the previous 8 years, probably combined. But I think I've also lived more and experienced more in the last year and a half, both in emotion and, physical actual achievement than I had in the previous years. I had an office job for the most part. I did a little bit of field work, but when you go in and you're on a computer, you can build some really cool spreadsheets or do some cool stuff in software, but it's not the same thing as being able to go to work hard all day, and then leave and look at a 40-foot long, 9-foot tall wall that you built and stood up that day.
Yeah, it is a great accomplishment, but you have all these little challenges along the way. So is there anything that comes to mind that it was just a day when you just, almost thought, how am I going to get over this? Because I didn't build my own house. I made a lot of the decisions, but even then you get these roadblocks that you just think, oh my goodness. And then before you know it, you're past that onto the next one.
Yeah, so we had a couple of those. The roof was my nemesis. So we've got a 2-story house. We have decently tall floor joists on the main floor and the second floor, and then our roof trusses have a 2-foot energy heel on top of them. So the ridge of the house is probably 30 feet off the ground. So I'm not afraid of heights, but I also don't love being up off the ground. So that roof, getting the sheathing up there was not the easiest thing in the world. Then once we got the sheathing up there, there was one specific day we had all the underlayment on, thought we had it stapled down pretty well, started to get really windy. I was down at my parents' place eating lunch or something, and I looked up and I started seeing the underlayment on the roof start to pillow as the wind was picking up. And then all of a sudden, one big length of it gave way and it was just flapping all over the place. So my heart pretty much sunk right at that point. And then there was nothing I could do about it. But once the wind died down, you kind of come up, assess the situation, figure out how you can get it fixed, and then go up and go at it. And it was just a slow plugging away of the roof. We ended up putting a metal roof on the house, and I had never done a metal roof or installed a metal roof before. But that was one of those things you figured out. The first couple panels aren't the prettiest, but you put those on the backside of the house where no one can see it. And then by the time you really figure it out, you've only got about 25% of the roof left, and then you'll probably never do it again in your life unless you make roofing your career. So the roof was one of those things that I showed up a lot of days and wish I was back at the office.
Right. So there were sections like that. With all this experience then, what has it taught you? Will you use it a lot again, or will you change the bits that you do next time or whatever?
I think from a teaching perspective, even though it took a really long time for me to do it, the planning and the early design work that we did made what I was doing that much easier, even though it felt really hard at times and it took a really long time. Had we not went through the design and the planning prior to it, I think it would have been way, way more difficult. So from a design phase and early implementation phase, that's the time where it doesn't cost you really much more money to take another month or 2 months to really get things lined out and understood. So that was a big learning experience for me. And then as far as going forward, I'd like to specialize in, high performance building envelopes. So just the envelope and the installation of that system. So your air barrier, insulation, your windows, pretty much the things that are the most important to high performance building. That's what I would like to specialize in. And I think the ability to do that in a more prefabricated strategy is what I would like to explore. Break up whatever building it is that you need to construct. You break those walls and the roofs and the floors up into smaller chunks where you can build those in a prefabricated style in a manufacturing setting, and then be able to put those on a truck, take it out to location, and then just pick up the big panels and go from a foundation to a finished dried in home within a week or so.
Yeah, there's a lot of mileage still in this, isn't there? I know. I think it's going to grow a lot, and there's less wastage, all sorts of benefits with prefabricated, particularly when it's going to be built to such high quality as well. Finally, then, maybe any advice for someone that is going to tackle their build hands-on like you've done?
No, it's going to take a long time, especially if you're doing it yourself. Plan, think through things, because it's a lot easier to make a mistake during that planning phase than it is when you're actually building it. So I did a ton of 3D solid modeling for the house in SketchUp. So I built the entire framing, all the framing, every single framing member I built in SketchUp before I actually built, cut any lumber whatsoever. And that helped me think through a lot of the different junctions and, how I would frame the window or whatnot. So definitely spend the time in that design phase, because other than a little bit of extra time, it doesn't cost you much. And then once you get into it, it's going to take longer than you think it's going to take. It's going to cost more than you think it's going to cost. But if you can be okay with that and know that going into it, it makes it a little bit more palatable. It's the engineering part of me thinks that I should be able to get my cost estimates really close and my timeline really close, but I wasn't. So if you can be okay with that, especially if you've never done it before, you're not going to be able to get everything right. And it's going to take longer than you think it's going to take. And there are going to be things that pop up that you didn't think about that you're going to have to spend money to buy or to get done. That's a big thing to think of. The other thing too that I've started to realize, especially as we've gotten more into the finishing stages of things, is that all your finishes end up costing a lot of money really quick, and they are the things that are the easiest to change. So if you are back and forth between wanting to, build a higher performance building and put some of your budget or more of your budget into good windows and air sealing and extra insulation, there's probably only going to be one time, maybe two times in the life of the house that you're going to have the opportunity to do that. And when you compare it to brand new wood floors or fancy kitchen countertops or what have you from an interior finish, those things really aren't that expensive. And it's really easy to swap out a kitchen countertop. It's really easy, relatively, to change out your flooring in your house. So if a budget constraint comes up and you have to choose between having really nice countertops or spending the money to put in an additional X amount of insulation and focus on airtightness, I would say really consider that airtightness and insulation piece, because you'll probably never do that again or never have the opportunity to do that again. But you can save up for a year and upgrade your kitchen countertops really easily.
And how about the family? Are they all happy with the house, the journey to get there?
It's been stressful. The kids are still young enough. So my daughter's 7, my son's 5. They thought it was cool every single time we moved to a different rental house in town. And I think we lived in 4 different rental houses within an 8-month time period. Oof. So they thought it was fun. My wife and I, not so much. And my wife, she was the one in charge of doing all the packing and everything because I was out working on the house. So she felt the brunt of moving even more. Wow. It's been really nice to finally get in the house, because when we were down in Colorado, we owned our home. We had owned the home for 8 years. It was, both the kids were born there. It was, something that was ours. And we went from that way of living to bouncing around to different rental houses where none of it was ours, all while trying to build our own place. So once we're finally in it now, even though it's not finished and we've got, sawdust all over the place and power tools laying around, it's ours. And we know we're going to be here for a long time. So that stress that was there before we moved in is kind of went away. And now it's just trying to figure out, how do you live in a semi-construction zone? But we're managing.
Keep going. Tully, thank you very much for chatting to me.
You bet, Ben. Thank you very much. Sure do appreciate it.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this session, houseplanninghelp.com/281, where you can review the key points once again in our summary, some photos of the build as well that you can cast your eye over. Of course, we'll have a link to Beartooth Passive House. And if you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can head down to the bottom of the show notes. There's a place to do that there. Once again, houseplanninghelp.com/281. Couple of quick bits of business. First of all, an iTunes review. And this one comes from Marcus Aurelius. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Probably not that one. I like a bit of Stoic philosophy, though. Stumbled across this via Twitter and very impressed with the breadth and depth of topics discussed. I sincerely hope that programs like this start to increase general awareness of what is required to build a good quality dwelling and break the monopoly that big developers have in only delivering poorly designed and constructed homes in this country. Yeah, it's still a massive issue, isn't it? But we'll try and do our bit, maybe one day. And one other thing today, if you're one of our Hub members, a quick Hub update. There's a new video to check out, and this is part of my in-depth video case study. I was thinking the other day, actually, as we plan ahead, we haven't got many more episodes of this to turn around, but we're still going for now. At the moment, we're seeing the lime rendering team complete the exterior finish. They're also addressing the levels, sorting that part out, because at the moment it looks like a bomb's hit the place and we need to level things up for the patio, for the driveway. They're also putting in a soakaway as well, which will take excess rainwater away from the house and just allow it to sink into the soil over time. And inside the house, it's all about the wet plaster layer. Mine is a masonry build, so this wet plaster layer, I think it's a gypsum plaster, is the final airtightness layer for that section. I mean, it joins onto membranes and so forth, but that's how it all works. You can check that out in the hub, along with all of our courses, our forum. We also have our live training sessions, conference calls that we hold from time to time, my office hours where you can come and have a chat with me. If you want to be a member, houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, we welcome the return of Nick Grant. He's back on the podcast, and we're looking at sharing knowledge, testing assumptions, and debunking. There's a good word. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.